Okay, so the next step in the process is to start on the final matte painting. So one of the goals is to create a final matte painting that is photorealistic. It's typically our goal in the film industry. So one of the best ways to accomplish that is to use photo reference. Use good photo reference. So what you see here is a bunch of photographs that I took in the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia, Canada, as well as my good friend Jonathan Harb took a bunch for me for this particular shot in Yosemite, California. So one of the best ways to use photo reference is to use photos, to choose photos that are most similar ambient sky. There's no direct sunlight on them, and so they'd be a pretty good fit for the areas of my matte painting that are in the shadows, perhaps in the cloud shadows, or perhaps in shadows. Take a look at them, flip them horizontally, vertically, whatever it takes. Just go through them and start creating a mental library of what's at your disposal. Visual effects crew. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the concept art and increase the canvas size. There's several good reasons for doing this. First of all, if we create the final matte painting larger than the 2:3:5 aspect ratio, that's going to allow us to cover for the full app frame or what have you that's required for film outs. Number two, if we create larger artwork than what we'll see in the final 2:3:5 crop, it allows us, whether it be you, the artist, the visual effects supervisor, or the director, to address any changes in framing, or in the event that this shot is going to go out to, some CG software and become a 3D shot. It allows us to create enough data to come and go as the camera moves through the environment. So what we want to do is we want to also choose photos that have similar perspective in the elements. So for example, the rock cliff here on the left, it's got a very similar camera angle to that in the concept art. The scale isn't too far off, and because all these things in the concept art are not really set in stone, we can tweak the scale a little bit and try and get some of these photoreal rock textures and trees to line up. So as we're working, it's also important to note that these elements should be kept on separate layers. There's a fine line between too many layers and not enough. Some people prefer to be minimalist, and others, prefer to just have complete control. And what I mean by complete control is to basically have the ability to split the major elements out for parallax reasons, or for curving the brightness, contrast, color values of the element. Color curves is something that I tend to use a lot, and with the color curve adjustment layer, it allows you to keep the element, in this case the rock texture, keep the It's also important to note that when you're matting out these images, just use a quick and dirty 2.Matte on the alpha channel. This can you can come back later and clean that up, but right now if you just keep it quick, it allows you to try out several different solutions. You can see here, I want to try a certain rock texture, quickly trace it out, apply a mask, scrub out anything that's really distracting, and then just slide it around and see how it fits into place. All this stuff is really saving you hand painting time. So if you spend a little extra time moving a photo reference around, it's really not wasteful. Ultimately, in the end, if you try out several solutions and you pick the best one, you're probably better off than just going with the first solution. I should say, than you would be going with the first solution or hand painting it. So I want to try and maintain some of that depth that I had in the concept art, some of that layering. There's a few different layers back in here on the left, and not too many. It's not too far away, but I want to try to keep the final matte painting similar to the concept art. Though, as I said earlier, nothing's set in stone with the concept art. It is still pretty important to keep in the spirit of the composition and the massing and the general lighting qualities, especially when a director or a visual effects supervisor has approved that artwork. Now, what I like about this photo here is that it has a you pretty much have a nice and quick replacement. Another thing that's important to note is as I said earlier, we are going to try and use as much photo reference as possible to save time in hand painting everything. Of course, a lot of this photo reference is going to need hand painted adjustments, color tweaking, and hand painting additions. Not to mention, finessing all the edges of the rocks and trees. So all that is a lot of time. There's a lot of time that's going to be invested in that later on. But it's important to note that basically, if you start off by using as much photo reference as you can, and leaving the other elements in your matte painting till later, then you get to establish as much photorealism as possible in your matte painting. What I mean by that is, there are going to be parts that we don't have the perfect photographic reference for. There are going to be parts like the palace, for example, that is not going to be photographic at all. It's just going to be a CG model rendered out. Background elements, we may not be able to find these mountains shot in this lighting and with this amount of atmosphere. So it is really important to use the photographs that are as close as possible where you can, as much as possible. And then in the end, we will try and go in there and hopefully, to a lesser degree, we'll recreate the final matte painting with additions, supplementations of CG and hand-painted areas. So adding some slight air glow or light wrap to the rock element can help it to appear more realistic, especially since we have the sun source located behind the mountain, and we have a little bit of sunlight, beaming through the atmosphere in the distance there. So using curves, you can attain some of that light wrap, or if you want, you can paint it on a separate layer as well. We have to get into hazing some of these cliffs back. This particular cliff, what I usually like to do when it comes to hazing is pick a color from the background and put a layer over top and fill it. Since the layer is grouped with that cliff element, He doesn't have to be matted. And then just go and take the opacity of that layer down until it starts to look acceptable. You can change the opacity to thin it out. You can change the darkness, the brightness of it to you know, it'll tweak the value. And all in all, when it comes together, you start getting a realistic atmospheric look. If you keep, this is a note to some of the beginners out there, if you keep the brightness of that atmospheric layer too bright, and you have the opacity of it set quite high, you tend to get what some of us call an additive effect or plussing. And it starts to, you know, because the computer is taking a simulated atmosphere haze layer and putting it over top of rock cliffs, you don't get a realistic read of rock detail as you would in real life. You know, in real life, atmosphere is a certain color and it can be illuminated. A very unrealistic looking solution, just because we have the ability to do things that are outside the norm. So if we use an atmospheric color that's a little bit too bright and it's very thick, or let's say it's very thin, we're seeing an inappropriate amount of detail coming through that haze of the rock texture itself. An important thing to remember is just that the amount of atmosphere and the amount of light hitting it are directly related to how opaque that atmosphere might look. So I'm taking a curve layer again. As I said earlier, I use curves an awful lot, and trying to adjust the amount of brightness and color in that layer of sun rays. And sometimes what I'll do is, if we have a light ray on a layer, I'll paint one and soften it accordingly, and then duplicate it several times and move them around, slightly offset them. Sometimes you can, you know, do what I just did here and put them behind the rock layer, and then sometimes you have two or three in front of the rock layer, and if they're slightly offset, you'll get varying thicknesses. You'll get varying amounts of opacity, and you'll start to get a slightly more natural look, especially, you know, right here, the areas in front of the rock. It seems to be stepped in maybe two or three different opacities, and so that's kind of mimicking what might be happening in nature, where what we're seeing here is light coming over top of that rock cliff, and because that top of that rock cliff is undulating and there's probably all types of different heights of rocks and trees up there, the light shaft isn't going to be continuous at the bottom. It'll be slightly undulating up and down. So don't forget to save your work. You know, it's very important to make sure that you save iterations of your work. I'm a big fan of saving multiple iterations throughout the day, because all of us have experienced computer crashes and some unlikely events of losing data because of software that, when it crashes, you know, sometimes it does corrupt the data, or, you know, you might have a power outage or what have you. So important to save a lot, save often, and save in iterations. So as I talked about before, you know, trying to use multiple layers of these light shafts. Really at this point in time, I'm just playing around with the look of the light, you know, how much I want to add. Coming from the concept art, because the concept art was done in a very much painterly fashion, there was a fairly large margin for us to conclude, for us to arrive at in our final matte painting. So the goal here is to keep some of that keep some of that character of, you know, that dramatic lighting that was in the concept art and make it photoreal. But there is a fine line between, you know, a photorealistic montage and a beautiful and photorealistic matte painting. So I'm just changing the angle around of these light rays. Again, it's really just kind of playing around with intensities, trying to make sure that I don't put too much brightness and draw the up in the top left corner. I don't want to draw the audience's eye too far up there. I want to achieve the sense of sunlight coming from up there, but I don't want to draw too much attention to the corners of the paintings. And alternatively, I thought it was important to brighten up that area on the other side, on the far side of that rock cliff, the area where the sunlight is hitting the palace. I thought, you know, because the palace is illuminated so brightly, it would make sense for that atmosphere to be illuminated quite brightly as well. That area is a little closer to the center of the image. The lines come from the top left corner down to the center to the palace, so the lines kind of help to draw the audience's eye into that palace, which is our focal point of the matte shot. And just keep in mind that when these matte shots are on the screen during a movie, you know, usually they're only on screen for 4 to 6 seconds. So I want to try and get more depth out of this bottom left corner here. As I said, I don't want to draw too much attention to it. You know, I'm not too worried about that. It's going to be pretty dark. But if we can add some haze layers. Just move things around, see if I can get the eye to focus more on the palace if I hide certain parts of the rock with this mist and haze. You know, we're establishing here that there's waterfalls, so certainly it's acceptable to have a lot of water particles floating up, kind of like we always see in Niagara Falls. And since the sun, you know, since this is kind of an early morning atmosphere, there's kind of a fog in the air, and as the sun is coming up over the mountains, we're establishing that there's not just a mist coming up from the falls, but there's just a fog over the entire land in a way. So using atmosphere is kind of it's a great way to, it's a great tool to make your matte paintings a little more beautiful, a little more dramatic, and perhaps most importantly, direct the eye to the focal point. So since we had a waterfall or a few waterfalls up on the top left in the concept art, I'm going to try and get something photorealistic in there right now. Later on you'll see that ultimately we turn these waterfalls into CG particles. I've seen that done before with not just CG particles, but practical effects. You know, little waterfalls of varying materials shot on stage and composited later into matte paintings. But what I want to do is I want to derive my look from something that's completely real. So I'll take this photograph from Yosemite and if we do want to have that many waterfalls in the shot, and somebody insists on having an element which is typically, typically people find waterfalls beautiful and therefore can attract attention because they're moving. We don't really need a secondary focal point over there on the left. So if we're going to have a waterfall in there, let's tone it down, darken it down. We'll try and achieve a photorealistic effect, but keep in mind that there's no lighting on it, and use as many excuses as possible to keep that waterfall darkened down, kind of Hollywood style, and just keep that focal point of the palace as the most important factor in the matte painting. So I'm just going about and trying to blend in some of these edges. I don't want to darken the falls and the rocks that come with the falls too far down. So what I'm doing is I'm keeping some of the value a little bit brighter than that cliff that I had there, and then just kind of painting in some edges that mimic lighter chunks of rock. So the edge there kind of blends from the photographic reference of the waterfall back towards the cliff that we established earlier. Color curves again, since it's a work in progress, using that adjustment layer, allows me to add some color, and then 5 minutes later you might see me take away that color, just based on how I feel the whole shot's progressing. Color curve adjustment layers will also allow us to matte out particular parts of the element. So in this case, I want to brighten up the waterfall itself, and sometimes I'll just I'll make that curve slightly red, slightly pink, just while I'm painting the alpha channel, and when I'm done, take that color out and adjust it to what I want it to be. The purpose in creating a overly red or pink alpha channel curve with an alpha channel is that you can see more directly the boundaries of that alpha channel that you're creating. So I just want to finesse some of the values in that bottom left cliff, some of the haze. Another thing that's nice about keeping these haze layers separate is that you can always go back and forth between their values and their opacities. Now here's an image that I thought, if I darken down, the entire photograph has kind of a similar atmosphere. I'm going to darken it down and use it as a reference, a photorealistic environment that is kind of comparable to what I'm trying to achieve. So if we look at the bottom of the photo, the color of light and the amount of atmosphere, and this type of rocky cliff-like environment, I just tried to find something that was similar and darken it down. That way you can take some cues. And, it might not be the perfect example of what you're trying to achieve, but it might also give you some ideas as to where you're obviously going wrong. So I'm just finessing some of the edges of this one layer, especially where the waterfall is, just because that was a higher contrast. It's the lovely thing again about these alpha channels is you can go in there and finesse edges whenever you want, add and subtract. I try not to apply the masks until the very end, just in case I want to add or subtract from the tree line or the rock edge or what have you. So over here in Oakland, I took some photographs. One day I went out with a small print of this concept art, and I went out in search of similar elements, whether it be buildings or edges for the lake, or just anything that can come to mind. There's this one building that I found. It was white with a red roof, And I thought, this might be a good thing to try and slap in there and see if we can get some type of some more architecture back in behind the palace on the left. Not necessarily part of the palace. It doesn't share the same architectural vocabulary, but just some type of junk, for lack of a better word, a bunch of stuff back in there that suggests that there's some type of town, there's more architecture, there's a little more complexity than what I had in the concept art. Typically changes like this, they're acceptable to most VFX directors and I mean visual effects supervisors and directors, as long as they're not too far off the concept. As something that's less fantastic, I'm going to try and ground it with elements that are based in reality. Whenever a matte painting has many elements that we are used to seeing, things like buildings at appropriate scales and mountains at scales that are very, earthly, the matte paintings will typically appear more realistic. When you're asked to create a sci-fi environment, often that can be quite challenging, just because in sci-fi we're trying to illustrate things in our environments that are not of this world, or perhaps in the future or in the distant past, where there are things that we're not used to seeing every day. One of the things that makes shots look real and feel real to movie-going audiences is that sense of familiarity when they see things in the shot that they see every day, then they buy it as being more realistic, just because they don't have to question it. Or there is no need to question it. A good way to get this domed building to sit back there in the painting is to not just tweak the brightness and value with the curve, but instead of adjusting the colors with the curve, I opted to change the opacity of that layer. By making it a little more transparent, it allowed some of the deep blue in the hillside to come through the red rooftop and the white walls. And that blue, instead of hunting for that blue in my curve and trying to achieve the right amount of cyan and magenta and all that, I just thought, well, I do this quite often. If I take a layer and I let some of the background color bleed through, then it'll start to marry itself. Again, I want that little bit of architecture back there to blend in. And be composited. You have to make sure that, if there's little camera move or whatever on this shot that forms parallax between the building and that hillside or whatever you have behind your element, you have to make sure that you don't see through the building and have pixels sliding around. In this case, I know that little domed building, that little town cluster, is going to be pretty much married with that hillside, so I don't really have to worry about the fact that we can see through to it, because since they're not moving in relationship to each other, and they won't be in the end, the audience isn't really going to sense that it was transparent. They're just going to see that it was hopefully the appropriate coloration. Now that background mountain on the right there, I think I'm just going to tweak the value of it, tweak the color a little bit, Just again, try and get everything to sit well together. Everything else, I'll just make a red line layer. I'll just take some red paint and I'll start circling things and noting where I want textures to be, where I want photographs to be, using their file names. And that way in your head you can, especially as I said, if it's a shot with a lot of textures, that way you can get a sense to what you might still need as the shot progresses, because you can't always put the shot together in 1 or 2 short days. It is good to keep an inventory of what you have and what you still need. If you're working on a shot for several weeks or several months, sometimes halfway through the shot, you still might not have all the photo reference you need. So if you keep a up-to-date library of or inventory of what you have and what you don't, it can help you in the end to hand paint a lot less. So with this cliff, I just matted it in there really quickly. Wasn't sure how much I could use. The background mountain in the photograph, I thought I might be able to fade it out. Obviously I'm not going to use any of the snow, but I'm just trying to position it. There's the rock cliff that's close in the photograph. I'm going to try and keep that, and then I'm going to try and soft matte out, or I mean matte out the areas that's not needed. This part here we can soft matte it, since there is a little bit of tree texture where it meets the close cliff. Let's see if we can keep any of that, just to suggest that there's a little bit more going on than just a cutout cliff in the midground there. So I'm just trying to tweak some of the values, make it sit well. It's really a matter of just playing around with it in relationship to everything else. One of the challenges is, of course, since everything is in flux, it's hard to get grounded. It's good if you have one element, like a plate, in which to tie all of your lighting to and all of your atmosphere and all that. When you don't have anything like a plate and you're creating everything from scratch, as I am with this matte painting, it makes it a little more challenging to achieve that photorealistic effect. The mountain in the background there, I'm not completely satisfied with the way it's sitting. Overall, the mountain just feels like it's a large rocky mountain, and at this point in time I'm a little uncertain as to how I want to solve its issue of scale. Rock can be a tough thing, at this distance, when the scale of trees isn't totally obvious. The texture in the rock doesn't necessarily tell us how far away it should be. So you have to take some artistic license and just try and figure out where it sits well, where it will end up being the best place. Compositionally too, I don't want the very tallest towers on the palace to coincide with the lines on that mountain. So I'm trying to scoot the mountain around a little bit and keep its massing from touching intersecting parts of the palace, and as well I don't want the tallest peak of the mountain to be touching the top of frame and all that stuff. Could be the foot of the mountain, kind of turning into some smaller hills back there, painted on its own layer. And ultimately, even if I paint something too dark, the nice thing about painting it a bit too dark is that you can just go in and take that layer and again give it some transparency, and it'll fade back into the element behind it. Overall, I just want to get a sense of layering back in there, try and make it complex enough so that it looks like there's several hills and mountains that are building upwards. Just want to even out some of the coloration down here at the bottom. It seemed like the dark values started a little too sharply, so if I brought some of that lighter pink color down, it would kind of feel like some rock is down there, as well as there's like a little dapple of light on it, but not a whole lot of light. Just as long as there's some detail as opposed to a flat color for now. Later on, this is something that you can come back repeatedly and touch up. One of the ways I like to work on the matte paintings is to bring everything up quality-wise in a consistent level. Often it's important to make sure that you don't just focus on one part of the matte painting and make it ultra realistic and kind of run out of time and not have time to address significant portions of the rest of the painting. So that's one reason why I do try and bring each piece of the matte painting up a certain amount, like to a certain level before finishing it, and doing that all over the matte painting, and then making another pass and then another pass, trying to finalize its detailing. I want to try and get a little bit of haze back in here over top of this rock cliff. I don't want it to feel like it's too close to the palace there. I'm just going in here and cleaning up some of the pixels on this tree layer. Because I went and sketched that foreground tree so quickly doing the concept art, there's a little bit of pixel bleed, just junk that was over top of the final matte painting rock cliff over there behind the palace, and it was kind of distracting. Wasn't allowing me to see what was actually there. Since that foreground tree isn't going to be in the final, I wanted to just clean it up and make sure what I was seeing is in fact final pixels and not concept art pixels. So as I said earlier, I keep going back to elements, elements that I didn't think were sitting in there quite right after 5-10 minutes. I go back and revisit them. Sometimes you revisit them a few days later, sometimes even a few weeks, and just try and get them to work out well. As you work with a painting, I think any artist has the inability to see their own paintings with fresh eyes. As time goes on, you start to develop that ability to see your paintings with fresh eyes, but I don't think any of us ever really get to the point where we can have as fresh eyes as we would like. You don't ever really get that kind of third-party kind of point of view when you've done the painting yourself. So what usually helps is to take a few hours or a few days away from parts of the painting, or away from the painting completely. If you have several matte paintings on your plate, it's good to take a little bit of time off from the real challenging ones, so that when you revisit them, you can attack the areas that you see as being problematic. As well, it's obviously a really good idea to get your peers, the input of your peers, and obviously the visual effects supervisors to give you comments. Okay, so it's time to start working on the rock cliffs down here in the foreground where the waterfalls are. So since the concept art had some rock cliffs that had their tops covered in vegetation, not really tall trees, but just shorter bushes and shrubs, whatever type of vegetation it is, I found some photo reference that was similar and had a little bit of top lighting on it. It's going to require some tweaking because it's kind of overly saturated for our shot. As well, some of the lighting, though it's top lit, somewhat appropriate for that area, it's not a perfect fit. I'm also going to try out just other shots with waterfalls. Notice the difference between this photo and the other photo. The way, since there's waterfalls in this particular photo, there's a large amount of that atmosphere or water particles that I mentioned earlier in the shot. And so right now is a good time to note how it's a good time to note how thick the atmosphere can be when there's waterfalls around. And so I'm going to eventually use these cues in hopes that it'll help to make the scene feel more realistic. The waterfalls that I have in the painting, they are quite large, probably around 100 feet or so, and usually when the falls are larger, they spew up even more water vapor and mist. Now, the problem with this photo is the sun was very high in the photograph, and so therefore the light shafts you see there on the left are coming almost straight down. They're very steep. It doesn't quite make sense with matte painting because we have a lighting angle that's a lot more horizontal. But I'm going to ignore that for now and just go on to trying to use certain parts of it for the falls, for the depth. There's nice depth found here in the rock texture, in the rock geometry itself, and the bodies of rock. And there's a randomness. There's a randomness that comes in nature that most people have a hard time painting. It might feel like you're painting random waterfalls and random positions, but typically when people try and paint randomly, there is a little bit of a rhythm that is found there. So using photo reference is also good for that. It's good for mimicking nature. So ultimately I want to try and use the best of both of these worlds, the best of both of these photographs, I guess I should say. the one with the waterfalls and the one with the vegetation on top of the rock cliffs. See what I can come up with. Okay, so I'm just gonna repo reposition the rock around a little bit more, trying to get it to sit nicely in the composition of things, correlating to that foreground left rock. In areas where it's necessary, I'll just kind of extend some of the trees, some of the vegetation, so it doesn't look cut off. And then here at the bottom, there's a bit of sunlight. There's a lot. So I'll just get rid of this stuff, paint it out. And then we don't have any sunlight reaching the bottom of our canyon there. So if you select the color from the background, choose create a new layer, and group it with that foreground rock, we have a nice atmosphere color to work with. I'm going to darken it down. You see me do this over and over again in matte painting, especially with a lot of atmosphere. Darken it down, change the opacity around of this haze layer, and ultimately try and tie that original photograph into the matte painting. Now, right now I'm pretty much just focusing on the rock texture. The vegetation on top is a little bit too bright, and it won't really be addressed by that haze layer because it's just too far out there in a different world. So I'm really just kind of focusing on where the rock is going right now, color-wise and contrast-wise. I'll come back to the vegetation in a bit. So I'm going to matte this out. You saw the curve adjustment layer that I warmed up, made it quite obviously yellowish. So that allows me to see the alpha channel that I'm painting. Obviously this isn't the final color of the vegetation. Some people choose to use a quick mask, and I just choose to create it this way. And I'm adjusting the brightness of the alpha channel that I just painted. Instead of being black and white, I'm bringing up the values just so that some of the color bleeds throughout the entire rock, but mainly it's addressing the vegetation. And then the opacity of the adjustment layer itself. Instead of going in the adjustment layer and tweaking the curve, I just decided to reduce its effect by using the opacity slider. So you'll see here I have a layer at the top of the stack called flat. What that is simply just a flattened version of the concept art. I use it throughout the process of creating the final matte painting to ensure that I'm still headed down the right path. I don't want to create a final matte painting that's too far away from the original concept art regarding composition and lighting angle, atmosphere, all the above. So you'll see me turn that on periodically. Back to the waterfalls. I'm feeling that the waterfalls should be a little more vertical, like the concept art. So try and stretch it vertically a bit. Find a good position. I'm looking at the waterfalls, but also towards on the left there's a rock cliff which has a nice atmosphere, nice depth on it. I'm going to try and keep that as well. Stuff that ends up that are animated, but I don't really want to use the concept art as a guideline or a map for that. I want to try and use real waterfalls. There's a certain amount of taper that we'll see in this particular waterfall, or in other ones. They taper off. They mist a certain amount. Sometimes they split into 2 or 3 streams of falls, and all that natural stuff comes from those photographs. I can mimic later on with particles. So I want to try and make it look like the waterfall back there in the rear is falling down and maybe hitting a cluster of rocks, large boulders, and then flooding out to create those 2 waterfalls in front of it. Maybe the water's just splitting down into 2 sides, or 2 separate canyons. So I just duplicated the waterfall layer there, as well as some of the color curve, or one of the color curves that came with it. And I figured that the large waterfall up on the left side of the frame would probably be more distracting as one single falls. So I think it needs, as I had in the concept art, it needs a partner there. It needs another mask to make it less distracting, which is kind of an interesting concept. For some reason, I feel like the one waterfall, which is just a fairly bright line on the dark rock, is a little bit more distracting from our focal point than 2 or maybe 3 over there on the left. This way, I feel it just becomes visual noise in a way, and it doesn't attract a lot of attention to itself. Along with that, I can also add a little more haze, since there's several waterfalls back in there. Doing the same thing with this falls as I did with the initial large falls there on its right. Just trying to make it fit into the rock, give it a little bit of opacity, similar color. So let's get into some of the atmosphere that's being created by these waterfalls. Just so that that little dark patch of vegetation isn't so distracting, I'm going to haze it back, the dark patch of vegetation from the concept art. We're going to replace that eventually, but for now, I'm just trying to search for a feel. The amount of, how much haze and mist do we want over top of these elements that we're going to be calling final matte painting elements. With a soft brush, I'm just kind of brushing around what is going to be haze and water particles thrown up in the air from these waterfalls, and I'm just going to brush it in all over the place and be kind of bold. At this point in time, being bold with this big brush is probably the best thing to do, because once you go too far, you can start to pare it back later on by various means. You can take the layer and give it more transparency, you can mask it out, and ultimately later on I'll show you how to use photographs of actual clouds and extract them, grain average them if necessary, extract them and put them in here so that the mist doesn't look so airbrushy. Ultimately, we do want a soft mist and a very full volumetric kind of look, but we do need a little bit of wispiness. So we'll get that later on. I'll show you how to do that. So maybe there's a little too much haze in the foreground. Let's get a little bit more depth, like that rock is being pushed out. Coming out of the mist. Curve it down, curve the mist down a little bit, make it darker in the corner. Just clean up some of this garbage out here. I don't want to forget about the waterfalls there on the right behind the foreground tree, but I'm not quite ready to focus on them. Now, down in the canyon, it's a little bit too bright, so I'm just painting a quick mask and feathered it and just darkening down the values of what's there. This will give us the sense that there's not as much light reaching the bottom of the canyon, which again is one of the main differences between that original photo reference that we had and the matte painting, what we're trying to achieve with the matte painting. Again, a quick comparison back and forth just to see if we're on the right track. I think so far that the lack of saturation, especially down where the waterfalls are in that canyon, is an improvement over that concept art. The concept art has a very colorful, very blue feeling down there, whereas we're a little bit more monochromatic in this final matte painting, and typically that's what happens as a concept art generally feels a little more cartoony because it has overly saturated colors. A little more drama and a little more boldness is needed, I think, to sell some of these ideas as concept paintings. But to make things look and feel photoreal, especially in hazy environments, it's in a matte painting like this, it makes sense to keep things a little toned down. We don't really want super blue color, super cyan colors down there in the valley, or in general in our shadowed portions of the matte painting. Just keep sliding elements around just to see if they can fit in a little better. I'm going to start to edge, paint in little trees and bushes, roughen up this. A little bit more haze as cloud bodies. For now we're going to keep this a little bit rough. As we zoom out, it's going to look fairly realistic. No one's ever going to see the matte painting up at this scale. If you've ever studied a real traditional matte painting, one that's a tangible painting on glass or on fiberboard, you've had the opportunity to see how rough they painted matte paintings back in the day. And when we do matte paintings digitally nowadays, we have the opportunity to do that on occasion, not always. But when you're painting at twice the resolution of your final output, often some of the scribble qualities or the painterly qualities will appear more realistic. So for example, you can see these are really rough tree lines that I'm painting in here, and we're at 271% zoomed in. So that's almost 3 times bigger than the actual 2K matte painting. Now, because I'm creating this 2K matte painting for this DVD, really the ultimate res is going to be animated and seen as a final product at 1K. For film, we do a similar thing. Since our goal is 2K, we'll paint at 4K. Generally speaking, many of us like to paint double the resolution of the ultimate goal, the ultimate product. Just going to scale down the palace a little bit, just because it was feeling a little bit too large in the composition. It was a little too large with respect to the mountains, and especially with respect to the lake in front of it and the waterfalls. Maybe slide it around a little bit, left to right. When you want your focal point near the center of your frame, you don't want to put it exactly in the center. You want it slightly just off center. Again, just a quick comparison. And save it.